Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and you may recognize my guest from his appearances on CNN, CNBC, the PBS NewsHour, and CBS Evening News. It's none other than Dr. Paul Offit. Dr. Offit, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Brian.
Oh, thank you. I have a brief bio on you, and we'll get right into it. Dr. Offit is a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases and director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is an expert on vaccines, immunology, and virology. Dr. Offit is co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine RotoTeq and is a member of VRPAC, the FDA Vaccines and Related Biological Products Committee. You have published more than 180 papers in medical and scientific journals, and you now are the author of 12 books, including Bad Advice, Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information, Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, Overkill from last year, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far, and your newest book, which we'll be talking about today, is You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccinations, The Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. Last year it was Overkill, and now it's You Bet Your Life. How does this book depart from those other books that I mentioned? Or is it a departure or a natural extension?
I think in many ways it's a natural extension. I mean, the book is really about making decisions under uncertainty. We always make decisions under uncertainty, even though we may not realize that. And so what I do is I go through sort of each of the major medical advances, from blood transfusions to transplants, antibiotics, gene therapy, biologicals, x-rays, chemotherapy, vaccines, and anesthesia, and go through the history, starting from the beginning. And then I take sort of a break at various intervals in the book and say, in the story, and say, okay, would you get it now? Would you get a blood transfusion now when we were basically using animal blood to transfuse ourselves? Okay, would you get it now after you now have figured out that there are these particular proteins, a so-called ABO blood group on your cells? Would you get it now, knowing that you hadn't really figured out that there was this RH blood group? So would you get it now? Okay, and then you have the AIDS epidemic where, blood was a dangerous source. Would you get it now, knowing that there are still, pathogens which either known or unknown for which we don't screen human blood? Okay, so knowing that, would you get artificial blood, which is just starting to be tested now in people? And so that's it. It's about trying to use all those stories to help us realize that we're always making decisions under uncertainty. We're always going to know more in the future. I mean, if you ask people, are we going to know more 100 years from now than now? I think everybody would say yes, but you want to believe we know everything we need to know now to make a fully informed decision, when that's pretty much never true.
Well, it's a great book, and as I've told you before, it's a great cover. It's nonfiction, but it reads like fiction because you take the information and you tell a truly compelling story, kind of, as you said, from a historical perspective, research perspective, from the doctor's perspective, from the victim, the patient perspective. And as a layperson now, I'm used to learning and hearing about these large trials with tens of thousands of people. But before a large trial, especially decades ago, correct me here, but some one person had to go first, and that's the patient perspective I'm talking about. And all of those perspectives you weave together to tell this story. Do you want to comment on that at all, or is that a fair assessment?
No, that's a fair assessment, and those are really a lot of brave people in there, including brave children who stand up. I mean, when we, for example, just did the trial of the mRNA vaccines in the 12 to 15-year-old, we already had data on the 16-year-old and up. You never really know, and I think that the parents who put their children in those trials, I think, should be congratulated. And I'm sure the ones who, if you just take that trial as an example, that was a 2,360 child trial. You either got vaccine or you got placebo. There were 18 cases of COVID in that trial, all in the placebo group. So I'm sure that the parents who were lucky enough by the flip of a coin to end up in the vaccine group were happy, and those who just got placebo weren't. But because of that now, we're able to move forward, and everybody can get that vaccine who's over 12 without having to worry about the flip of a coin. So yeah, I think these are the true heroes in medicine.
You divide the book into 3 sections: risk, oversight, and serendipity. And from writing the book and looking at medical advancement, you've just talked about uncertainty, but do you think there'll ever be a time when risk can be eliminated?
No, I think anything in medicine that has a positive effect, by definition, will have a negative effect, even if it's extraordinarily rare. It's the rare. I can think of no example really where something doesn't have a negative effect. I think, frankly, if something doesn't have a negative effect, it probably never had a positive effect.
Like homeopathy?
Like homeopathy, right?
So nothing is risk-free, but you mentioned this briefly in the intro. There's a point where you have to draw a line in the sand, the risk line of when do you take the risk and accept the uncertainty. And so from reading the book, it seems like risk sometimes is correlated with the rarity of disease. So in other words, a very rare disease might be studied less, and there'll be less participants. And also, if it's a rare and deadly disease, the risk can be overshadowed by the threat of death from the disease. And here I'm thinking about specifically your first chapter on heart transplants and how that came about in the 60s and 70s and those people that really had to be at the forefront of that. You want to talk about that specific example at all?
Sure. Well, I mean, probably one of the most famous physicians in the world at that time was Christian Barnard, who did the first human-to-human heart transplant. And it led to just sort of an explosion of heart transplant centers in not just the United States, but really throughout the world. And over that sort of the years that followed that first transplant, there were those heart transplant centers became fewer in number. They did fewer and fewer transplants, and the year of the heart transplant became an enormous disappointment as we realized there were so many things we didn't know about how to best suppress the immune system so that you wouldn't reject this foreign heart, and how to really develop the kinds of immune suppressive drugs which weren't so immune suppressive that you died of overwhelming infections, but suppressive enough to be able to keep you from rejecting your heart. And just the technology of techniques of how to best sew the heart into the chest cavity, et cetera. So all that needed to be learned. And as it was learned, now you have more and more people who get heart transplants. But the fact of the matter is you have about 4,000 people today that are on the heart transplant waiting list because not enough people really are willing to be organ donors. And 1,300 of those people will die while waiting. So maybe what they should consider is getting a pig's heart. I mean, that now is starting to be considered. And do you want to be the first one to do that? Do you want to really be a pioneer, much as the way that the first heart transplant was a pioneer? The first heart transplant, lived for about 18 days. And nonetheless, that doctor, Christian Barnard, was celebrated as a hero, even though, the person, Louis Washkansky, who was the transplant recipient, lived for fewer than 3 weeks. So we learn as we go, and I think people need to understand that when we have medical advances, it's never about when you know everything. You pretty much never know everything. The question is, when do you think you know enough? When do we think we know enough to move forward with various innovations?
You also have a chapter on anesthesia under the risk category. It's a really interesting history of anesthesia and the development. And I just want to say, if someone doesn't appreciate anesthesia from locals to full anesthesia, read this chapter, and before you do that, look at an image of a British naval surgeon's medical kit from the 1700s, and you'll know what I'm talking about here. But one of the things you write in the book is that despite anesthesia working, it's still unknown exactly how the mechanism works. So that was very bizarre to me. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, no, it's bizarre to me too. You would assume that at this point, since we're sort of, more than a century into anesthesia, that we would have a clear understanding of how it works. I mean, from the days of ether to nitrous oxide and chloroform, now to the more sophisticated, sort of fluorines, et cetera, that we use for anesthesia. Still, we don't really have a good idea of how they work. And recently I had a surgery a few weeks ago, which was like a 5-hour surgery. So obviously I had general anesthesia for a fairly long time. And I got a chance to talk to the anesthesiologist before, I got wheeled in and asked that question. I mean, do we know more about exactly what's happening in that neuron in my brain that allows me to sort of, feel nothing and be out and then recover? And the answer still was no, not much. And so it is surprising.
Yikes, that's an interesting conversation to have as you're being wheeled in. Do you know how this works? And the doctor goes, no, here, count backward. Yikes, frightening. The section on oversight is kind of really interesting to me as a layperson. It's perhaps, I guess, the most important to me. There wasn't always an FDA, which seems bizarrely underappreciated at times. And it wasn't even 100 years ago that one could be risking one's life by taking a medicine that was solely based on the assurances of the manufacturer. Yet I never thought about oversight as part of medical advancement until your book, in which, of course, it's featured quite heavily. It makes perfect sense, but can you give me an example of why this is so, why the FDA was founded?
Right. So I think there's a historian named Michael Harris who said it best. He said the history of drug regulation is built on tombstones, and that's certainly true. I mean, there was in the early 1900s. We used to treat diphtheria. We used diphtheria-specific antiserum or antitoxin. The famous Iditarod race was based on taking diphtheria antisera, traveling from Nome, Alaska to Dedham, Alaska, which is the Iditarod race, because there was an outbreak of diphtheria in Nome, Alaska. But it was found that there was at least a batch of that diphtheria antisera in St. Louis that had been inadvertently contaminated with tetanus spores, and therefore a number of children died, about 13 children died of tetanus after getting this diphtheria antitoxin, and that gave birth to something called the Virus Toxin Act that allowed that never to happen again. And then in the 1930s, sulfa drugs were hailed as the magic bullet, for the treatment of a wide variety of bacterial infections. And there was something called the elixir sulfanilamide disaster, where there was one company named the Massengill Company of Bristol, Tennessee, which used as a solubilizing agent so that this could be taken by mouth, easily taken by mouth as a liquid instead of a pill. They used diethylene glycol, which was toxic to kidneys. And again, about 100 people died from that experience, 34 of whom were children. And, it gave birth to really the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Then there was the thalidomide disaster, which gave birth to the Kefauver Amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. I mean, we learn as we go. Probably the one people could appreciate now is when we talk about going from an emergency use authorization to full approval. And people make a big deal of that, right? I don't want to get this vaccine yet. I want to wait until it's fully approved or fully licensed by the FDA. The difference between those two things really is that what the FDA does, and this was born of an incident that happened in the mid-1950s, what the FDA does is they don't just license the product, they also license the manufacturing site and the process. I mean, for biologicals like a vaccine or like a monoclonal antibody, the process is the product. It's not like amoxicillin, where you have 50 milligrams of amoxicillin. And this tablet, after this batch is made, and 50 milligrams after that batch is made, it's easy to detect that. But here, the process becomes the product. So every aspect of that process has to be validated with protocols. And that takes, on average, about 10 months. We did that much more quickly here. But that was born of something called the Cutter incident, where the term consistency lot was born because 2 lots that were made by Cutter Laboratories, which was a company in Berkeley, California, made polio vaccine badly. And as a result, what they didn't do was they didn't fully inactivate polio vaccine virus with formaldehyde. As a consequence, 120,000 children were inoculated with live, fully virulent polio virus. 40,000 of them developed abortive or short-lived polio. About 164 were permanently paralyzed for the rest of their lives, and 10 died. I think it was actually the worst biological disaster in this country's history, and really gave birth to the Centers for Biological Evaluation and Research, now part of the FDA. At that time, it was still regulated by essentially NIH. So we learn as we go. The lessons are invariably painful. There was always a human cost for knowledge, and it's something we're never able to accept. Even now you see that. Even now, with the vaccines for COVID, which are incredibly safe and incredibly effective. Nonetheless, these so-called vectored virus vaccines of AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson are very rare causes of severe blood clots, severe, occasionally fatal blood clots. Now, it occurs in 1 in 500,000 people, and you're much more likely to get those same severe blood clots if you're naturally infected with the virus than if you're vaccinated. But there's always a surprise at some level because we always learn as we go. I can think of no instance where that's not true.
Well, interestingly, in very recent history over the past year or so, I think I've called it Schudingers FDA because it's been criticized for moving too slowly and too fast, both at the same time. And sometimes when people perceive it moving too slowly, you'll hear the words, "we'll bypass the FDA." So when you hear the words a politician utter, "we may have to bypass the FDA on this," what do you think about that?
I think it is an enormously dangerous thing to say. If we get to the point in this country, and I think at some level we are at the point in this country, where we don't trust the FDA or we don't trust the CDC, we're in trouble. I mean, as we headed up to in the last administration, and Trump administration's development of that vaccine under Operation Warp Speed, what really worried me is that we would bypass the phase 3 trials or truncate the phase 3 trials. And by phase 3 trial, I mean that's the trial that you do to see whether the vaccine is safe. That's the trial you do to see whether the vaccine is effective, because you give the vaccine to tens of thousands of people, give a placebo to tens of thousands of people, watch what happens. And that's the only proof. Zeke Emanuel and I both wrote an op-ed actually in the New York Times saying we feared an October surprise, because with the pending election on November 3rd, we worried that the administration would sort of reach its hand into Operation Warp Speed, pull out a couple vaccines and say, trust us, we're sure this is going to work. And that would have been an enormously dangerous thing to do. But it didn't happen, because the FDA actually did stand up and say, no, we want 2 months of safety data after the last dose, which then pushed the vaccine to beyond November 3rd. And you know, now we could be comfortable that we were at least knowing as much as we could, giving the vaccine to tens of thousands of people, knowing that we're about to give it to hundreds of millions of people, and you're trying to predict what's going to happen from those tens of thousands when it goes to hundreds of thousands, frankly, hundreds of millions. And that's always but you know, we're talking now about the vaccines for children, right? For the children less than 12 years of age, are now all going back to school. That's a fully susceptible population, all in one place. There's the Delta variant. We're moving into winter. There are certainly places where this virus is raging. And so we want a vaccine for children. We do. And I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. I want a vaccine for children too. But remember, you're giving the vaccine to thousands of children to test it in thousands of children, and then it goes into millions of children and tens of millions of children. And, you know, you hold your breath at some level. It's always true. You know, Maurice Hilleman, who I think is the father of modern vaccines, said it best. This is a guy who did the primary research or primary development of 9 of the 14 vaccines that we give to children. And he said, quote, I never breathe a sigh of relief until the first 3 million doses are out there. And that's always true. And that's not something you're gonna have pre-approval or pre-authorization.
You just mentioned that you're on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. Do you have dates on the board to look at the data and approval? Or can I not ask that question?
No, you can ask. You can always ask. Yes, I'm on the Vaccine Advisory Committee, which causes people to think I know far more than I do about when we're going to be seeing these data. I know that we're going to be reviewing flu strains for the Southern Hemisphere on September 30th. That I know. But that we do that every year. I think in terms of when we're going to get the data for these vaccines for children between 5 and 11 years of age, I hope soon, but I have no idea.
And if anybody wants to question the FDA and why it's necessary, I think you've written about this before, just look at the 1994 Dietary Supplement Act or whatever it was called, where supplement control was wrestled away from the FDA, and now any huckster can make a claim. As long as they make a claim and say they're not making a claim at the same time, however they do that, you can just imagine if that happened with biologics and pharmaceuticals, if you only had the assurance of the manufacturer.
Right.
So serendipity, that's another section in the book. How does serendipity work into medical advancement?
Right. Sometimes a tragedy can be instructive. I think that was true with the first chemotherapy. The thinking at the time was that there were a few publications that came out of NYU that implied that folic acid, stimulating folic acid, could actually have an anti-cancer effect. We learned, however, that the opposite was true because of a massive tragedy that happened actually under the auspices of Sidney Farber, who is probably one of the greatest cancer researchers in the world. That's the name. The Dana-Farber Cancer Center in Boston is named after Sidney Farber. And what he did was he, based on these studies that were done in mice, where it was assumed that it was sort of a folic acid agonist, something that worked to promote folic acid, was actually causing these mice to have a regression in their tumors. It was actually the opposite was true, because when he then gave it to children, a few dozen children, their bone marrows exploded with cancerous cells, and they died much more quickly than they would have. And this was for a disease, acute lymphocytic leukemia that was uniformly fatal, usually within a year. And he was actually able to take those children and make them worse, which was not an easy thing to do. And then what became clear was the opposite was true. It was actually folic acid antagonists, things that worked against folic acid, which is a nutrient, that actually worked much better. Actually, and interestingly, the first recipient of that, and the sort of the modern day equivalent of these so-called folic acid antagonists is methotrexate, which is, or aminopterin, which I think may be familiar terms. But the first person really to receive that was a New York Yankee who had the number 3 on his back, and that was Babe Ruth. He was actually the first person to receive a chemotherapy that worked.
In the epilogue, you wrote, and somewhat presciently maybe, that people are fearful of doing something and being harmed than doing nothing and being harmed. And to bring it back to right now, that's kind of where we are right now. But it's not due to the lack of oversight or serendipity. It's due to a massive amount of mis and disinformation. I think just last week in JAMA, they had published some study of 6.2 million mRNA recipients and no serious adverse events from the vaccine. Can you comment on where we are now with being fearful of doing something and being harmed versus not doing something and being harmed?
No, that's right. It's sort of the sin of omission versus the sin of commission. If we do something to ourselves or to our children and there's a negative outcome, that is viewed as a much worse thing than, say, not giving a vaccine and having something bad happen because of the disease. There are no risk-free choices, which is a point I try to make consistently in this book. They're just choices to take different risks. And I think the goal is to try and dispassionately and clearly figure out what those risks are. I mean, if you, for example, if you choose to get a vaccine, an mRNA vaccine, and you're between 16 and 29 years of age, you have about a 1 in 50,000 chance of developing myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. And although it's generally short-lived and self-resolving, it never sounds good. I mean, the term mild myocarditis sounds like a contradiction in terms. I mean, whenever you have heart muscle inflammation, that's not a good thing. And there are some people who suffer more seriously than the ones who have just mild illness. So that's your risk. It's 1 in 50,000. If you look at a study that was published in Journal of the American Medical Association Cardiology Journal, they looked at basically a group of older adolescents and young adults who were college athletes in the Big Ten. And they took every one of them who had COVID, mild, moderate, severe COVID, whatever. Every one of them had an MRI of their heart, so-called gadolinium enhanced MRI, every one of them, to see whether they had evidence of myocardial inflammation of the heart muscle. Basically, 1 in 45 did. So therefore, if you get SARS-CoV-2, if you get COVID, you have a 1 in 45 chance of developing some level of myocarditis. If you get the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, you have a 1 in 50,000 chance. Well, any reasonable person would look at that and say, okay, I'll get the vaccine. But see, people don't think of it that way, or some people don't think of it that way. They think, I'll take my chances with the infection, even though your chance is much higher. And for children, that suffer this multi-system inflammatory disease, 50% to 75% will have evidence of myocarditis. So it's, if you believe what John Udell, who's the head of the virus research lab at NIH said, and I completely think he's right on this, over the next few years, you're going to have 2 choices. Get a vaccine or get infected. And the vaccine's always the better choice.
I grew up learning about success stories, or I should say, I grew up hearing about success stories, and new medical breakthroughs are always right around the corner. And you mentioned this at the intro, that we have some advances coming forward. You specifically mentioned in the book vaccines for Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and dementia. Any word on how close those are?
No, I think not very would be my guess. I think we're still working at that. I mean, there's always these flashes of hope. It's always sort of 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But I think that will happen in my lifetime. So I plan to live about 15 more years, and then I suspect I'm going to be captured and killed by anti-vaccine activists. But that's just my current plan. Hopefully that'll be changed.
I'm not sure that's a good plan. I wouldn't push the button on that plan. We need you around. Same thing with the pig hearts. I think that's coming out of Boston. It was a big story last year as you were finishing the book. I think that Dr. Pearson here from Massachusetts General Hospital said we're about a year out, 35 years of research behind us, better suppressants, genetically modified pigs so that the hearts do something with blood clotting. He said, by the end of 2021, we'll have that first pig heart in a human. I paraphrase, okay? So now we're almost at the end of 2021. Any updates on that?
I haven't heard it. I'm still waiting for that. The other thing I talked about in the book a little bit is CRISPR technology, which is a gene editing technology. And when I was writing the book, I posited, as we all did, that that's particularly effective for these diseases where it's just a single gene, like sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis, which is just a defect in one gene. So it lends itself to this kind of targeted gene therapy. And at the time, we didn't really have any of those data. But now what you can do is you can take sort of the bone, remove some cells from the bone marrow of people, say, with sickle cell disease, edit them so that now they make the right kind of hemoglobin instead of this hemoglobin that causes red blood cells to collapse and sickle and cause all these painful crises and shortens your life, in half, so that people usually don't live past 40. And now you're just starting to see the first of those CRISPR technologies uses in people who have sickle cell disease, and one woman, is doing quite well. But you never know. You take this 45-year life currently with sickle cell disease, where you're going to have a lot of these so-called vaso-occlusive crises, which are really painful crises that cause you to go to the hospital and get painkillers and get blood transfusions. Many people who have sickle cell disease become addicted to opioids because of their chronic need for painkillers. And now she's free of that. She is. But is there something we're going to find out where that we didn't know, which is so often true? I just, you always, and then we'll know, right? And then we'll learn. I mean, you look, for example, at gene therapy, I'm at Penn, where we had the Jesse Gelsinger death. I mean, was a 19-year-old boy who had an enzyme deficiency, and he was treated really with basically an adenovirus that had the gene he needed, that was replication defective, very much like the J&J vaccine, very much like the AstraZeneca vaccine, except the quantity of virus he was given was exponentially greater than that. And he was overwhelmed. He had essentially a sepsis-like phenomenon. It looked like he had a severe bloodstream infection caused by a bacteria. That's what it looked like. It wasn't true. Just a massive immune response against himself that caused him to die. In that process, though, you realized what had happened, that he was making this one immunological protein that killed him. Now we have a monoclonal antibody directed against that particular protein, which is called interleukin-6. And because of that was another example of serendipity. But because of Jesse Gelsinger's death, we learned something that then allowed, people who get the same sort of gene therapy, about 80% of them now require a drug that wasn't available when he died. So again, you learn as you grow. I mean, early heart transplants, early kidney transplants, early lung and liver transplants were brutal, but we learn as we go.
And I did mention this at the outset, but I do think that's something that's really good about your book, is that you also write from the victim's perspective. So anybody that got an early heart transplant, somebody died and donated that heart, and you tell their story as well. And the family that's involved. So I appreciate that, because I think that's sometimes something that's underreported when we hear about, a Christmas miracle that somebody finally got a heart on Christmas Eve. Well, some other family's grieving for that, and you tell their story. So thank you for that. I want to go back actually and ask a question about one of your previous books, if you don't mind, Pandora's Lab. You wrote in there about the opiates and opium, and now that's come around again. I don't know. Do you want to comment any on the Sackler family in Purdue and the lawsuit with that, or do you want to avoid that?
No. So I think I would recommend the book Empire of Pain, which goes through the whole Sackler story. I mean, it's a pretty tragic story. I mean, this company knew that they were basically encouraging opioid addiction. They did everything they could, frankly, to encourage addiction, to promote the addiction, by denying what was clearly evident to them. And they've recently, paid a price. Although I honestly, there was no amount of money that they could have been fined that would have, in any sense, made up for the enormous amount of death in their wake. It's just awful. One other thing, because you just brought it up, and it reminded me of something, if you don't mind. Because I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, when we did a trial of the 12 to 15-year-old, right? That was a 2,360 child trial. Half got the vaccine, half got placebo. When that trial was over, there were 18 cases of COVID, all in the placebo group. And I got a lot of pretty pointed mail, which is a nice way of saying hate mail, from people that said 2,300 children, really? That's how many you want to test before you go put it into millions of children? 2,300? And my response to that was, okay, I mean, you want to do a 23,000 child trial, in which case then it won't be 18 cases of COVID in the placebo group. It'll be 180. I mean, how much human suffering are you asking for here for the knowledge that we want? I mean, what price knowledge? How big of a price knowledge? And the one story that I tell in this book, which is the one that breaks my heart the most, and frankly broke Jonas Salk's heart, is the polio vaccine story. I mean, when Jonas Salk had an idea for how to make a polio vaccine, right? Grow the virus up, purify it, kill it with the chemical, formaldehyde, and then inoculate it into people. So you can't possibly get polio. You presumably get antibodies against polio virus, which will be protective, which is what he did. He inoculated 700 children in the Pittsburgh area and found that the vaccine was highly immunogenic and safe. And he said, I've got it. This is it. This is the polio vaccine. But the March of Dimes and under Basil O'Connor, as well as others, wanted to do a trial to prove that it worked and prove that it was safe. He didn't want to do that. The reason is that the way the trial was constructed, 420,000 children were going to get the vaccine, 200,000 children were going to get placebo, meaning salt water, and 1.2 million would be observed uninoculated controls. He didn't want to give first and second graders a shot of salt water as we entered polio season, which was the summer. He didn't want to do that. He just couldn't conscience doing that. So when the trial was over, it was declared to be safe, potent, and effective. Those were the three words that appeared on every headline in every newspaper in this country. And how do we know it was effective? We knew it was effective because 16 children in that study died of polio, all in the placebo group. We knew it was effective because 36 children were paralyzed in that study, 34 in the placebo group. I mean, those were first and second graders in the 1950s. I was a first and second grader in the 1950s. I mean, but for the flip of the coin, those children could have lived as long as I've lived and lived a long and happy and productive life. But they were denied that because of that coin flip. And again, I ask this question throughout the book. What price knowledge? What human price are you willing to pay for knowledge? Are we willing to pay for knowledge?
And with the polio vaccine, that rollout was years, right? It took years to get the polio numbers down. What was it, 3 or 4 years before to get the population inoculated or vaccinated? And with the COVID vaccine, as you've mentioned it, I'm going to mention it, I guess. When that was approved or under an EUA, there were millions of doses ready to go. Could the entire population have been vaccinated in 1 year? I know we're not, but was it possible so that we could have nipped?
Yes. I mean, to the credit, first of all, to credit the Trump administration, within 11 months of identifying and sequencing this virus, SARS-CoV-2, in January of 2020, we had two large clinical trials, one 30,000, another 44,000, using a novel technology, messenger RNA, that showed the vaccine was safe and effective, and we were ready to mass produce it. So the Biden administration really, I think, gets credit for mass producing it and mass distributing it and mass administering it in a country that didn't have a public health system geared toward mass administration of adults. And we gave 1 million doses a day, 2 million doses a day, 3 million doses a day, 3.5 million doses a day. This was months ago. If we had continued on that path, and we could have, we certainly had enough vaccine. We had an infrastructure to do it. The vaccine was free. It was easily accessible, but we hit a wall. And we kept coming down. If we continued at that pace, we would have 85 to 90% of the population vaccinated now, easily. And we wouldn't be having these discussions about masking, about how we fear children going back to school. But we hit a wall. And that wall was basically, there are now about 60 to 70 million people in this country who are saying, no thanks, I don't want a vaccine. I want to continue to allow this virus to spread. I want to continue to allow it to do harm. I want it to continue to allow it to mutate and create variants which may become more resistant to vaccine-induced immunity, because I don't give a damn about my neighbor. I think this is a civil liberty. I think it's a personal choice, and I am not going to get this vaccine. And what do? We can do nothing. We can stand back and say, okay, Your choice. If you want to catch and transmit potentially fatal infections, sure, go ahead. Or we can do what I think we're trying to do. And you know, President Biden, this plan to try and handle this pandemic. His plan is heavy with mandates, which I think is the only way to handle it at this point. If people are so willfully ignorant, so incredibly selfish as to not get a vaccine because there is no good reason not to get a vaccine, there's just a lot of bad reasons. And then I think you have to basically compel them to do it, much as we have stop signs at intersections. You know, people can't just go through that, no matter what happens, as a measure, as a statement of personal freedom.
Now that I'm sorry we've gone into the topic, I just have to make one remark, and you may consider this an incredibly stupid remark, but I want to relate some information that's just all out there, all right? And I want you to comment on it. So you see on Facebook, you see in the social media, COVID doesn't affect kids, so we don't have to study on them. They shouldn't wear masks. If they get it, it's not that big a deal. You work at a children's hospital of Philadelphia. Based on that statement on social media, I'm assuming there's no children there that have COVID-19?
Yeah, wrong.
Okay, so go through that then. Where does that misinformation? Thank you.
Right. Apparently, you're allowed to lie on the internet because you're right. There's a lot of misinformation there. So right now, the children, meaning people less than 18 years of age, account for 27% of all cases. More than 1/4 of cases now are in children. Last week and during this past week, we had 250,000 children who were tested and found to be infected. Remember that not everyone gets tested. And the week before that, it was 200,000. The hospitalization rate, depending on sort of where you look, is between 1% and 2%. So between 2,000 and 4,000 children are now getting hospitalized. The death rate is certainly much, much lower than it is in say, someone who's elderly. The death rate in children is around 0.03%. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, now you're talking about 7, 8, 9, 10 children dying a day. We already have more than 450 children who have died from this virus. So the notion that children are somehow naturally immune to this and can't suffer this or be hospitalized from this virus or go to the intensive care unit. We now have a handful of children in the intensive care unit in our hospital. We are seeing what the country's seeing, which is clearly an increase in cases in our COVID ward because we're reflecting the national average. So it's just awful information. I mean, I had to do a debate the other day with someone who kept saying that he thinks that there should be mandates for older people, but not for younger people. Why not? Younger people certainly can suffer this disease. I think everybody over 12 years of age who's going to school now should be mandated to receive a vaccine. I think every teacher who teaches those children of any age should be mandated to receive a vaccine because there is no good reason not to get it. And also these sort of pop-offs we have with religious exemptions or philosophical exemption. What religion, first of all, has in its major text that you shouldn't be vaccinated, considering that all the religions, frankly, were founded well before 1796 when the first vaccine came out there. But, you know, religions teach you to care about your family, to care about your neighbor, care about society. I think the choice to put yourself and others in harm's way is exactly an unreligious thing to do. And, you know, this whole thing was kind of, you know, philosophical exemption, right? Philos, love, sophos, wisdom. Where's the wisdom that says it's better not to get a vaccine than get one? Or personal belief exemption. Vaccines aren't a belief system. They're an evidence-based system. So I don't like those pop-offs. I mean, that's so classically American, you know, that we bend over backwards for when somebody says, you know, well, this is an expression of my faith. Really? Putting yourself and your children and others in harm's way is an expression of your faith? What religion is that? Because all the religions I know teach you exactly the opposite of that. And we all do that. I think every hospital certainly the Penn healthcare system have a religious exemption. Our hospital has a religious exemption. It's frustrating for me because it doesn't make any sense. And people use it as a fallback. I mean, they just don't want to get the vaccine because they breathe the kinds of things that you're talking about on the internet. And they just use that as a fallback. And we all stand back and say, okay, well, that's an expression of your faith.
Perhaps odd about the misinformation and frightening is, I think I was up in Maine last week and on the news, they're losing first responders because they'd rather be fired than get the vaccine. They're losing nursing staff. People are withdrawing from nursing school because they don't want to get the vaccine because it's mandated by the university. That is a bizarre outcome for people that are actually involved in medicine. Can you comment on that at all? Do you deal, if you're going through nursing school or you're a first responder, an EMT or a paramedic, how does it get in your head that the vaccine is a bad thing?
There's a lot of bad information out there, and people are compelled by it. We also are compelled by conspiracy. I mean, this sort of the movie that came out called Plandemic, which came out like in May of last year before there ever was a vaccine, but it sort of hinted at sort of the term plandemic. There was a plan. That people like Bill Gates somehow planned this, or there were sort of these evil forces that planned. So remember, about 15% of Americans believe in the tenets of QAnon. I mean, we're theory crowd. So we're very much lured by conspiracy. I mean, the whole Pizzagate thing, associated with the previous elections. I mean, that is something we're so prone to. What can I say? There's just a lot of bad information out there that causes people to make bad decisions, that puts them and others they come in contact with in harm's way. I'm amazed by people who work in nursing homes, where they're taking care of elderly people who are at a very high risk of dying from this virus, who don't want to get the vaccine and think it's somehow their right not to do that. I mean, at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, we now have a vaccine mandate. I mean, there's definitely going to be pop-offs with religious and philosophical exemption, but we are going to compel anyone who works around a vulnerable population of hospitalized children to do what they should do, what's the right thing to do if they're going to be part of our community, a community that consists of parents trusting us with their children. Then they have to protect those children. We also have a flu vaccine mandate, so it's not like, this is unprecedented.
Let's get back to You Bet Your Life and sum it up. I know for Pandora's Lab, I think you got hate mail for your chapter on Rachel Carson for overkill. It was hate mail for stents. If you can step back and look at this book, is there anything in it that you think you might get some hate mail about?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's although I'm always wrong about this, but I do think that it's a a clear-eyed and somewhat dispassionate look at the choices we make. And so here are these 9 major medical advances to see that there is a learning curve here. I mean, you could reasonably call the book The Learning Curve. And some people would argue, well, why don't we just wait till the learning curve is over and then I'll get that particular innovation or advance. But first of all, the learning curve is pretty much never completely over. And secondly, a choice not to, say, get sulfanilamide back in the late 1930s, when you knew that one of the products had a problem. The other products didn't have a problem. The tablets didn't have a problem. So you could say, well, I don't know whether it's the sulfa or not that's causing these children to die of kidney failure. I'm going to not get the drug. But if you had a bacterial infection, you were making a bad choice. So it's really just about making decisions under uncertainty and using these 9 major medical advances as an instruction sort of guide to making decisions under uncertainty, because we're always making decisions under uncertainty. So I don't think I'm going to get hate mail on this. But again, I'm always wrong about that, so I'm sure I will. Well,
maybe the next book could be hate mail I've got through the years. Hate mail I've received through the years. Just take people's, I don't know, it might be instructional for some people. Dr. Offit, thank you so much for being here. Your newest book is You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccinations, The Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. It is a great read. Like I said, it reads like fiction, and it's heartfelt, it's inspiring, and it's scary. It's everything all at once. So thank you so much for another great book.
Thanks, Brian. Take care and stay safe.